Most people think the Stanley Hotel is just a haunted landmark, the pretty white facade that inspired a horror novel and a few ghost tours. But in 1909, an emaciated inventor named Freelan Stanley dragged himself up a mountain road at 8,000 feet, convinced the thin air might save his lungs. He poured whiskey money into a 140-room palace of light and music, built to fight death with elegance. Decades later, a writer would wake from a nightmare inside those walls and turn it into The Shining. So what exactly did Stanley build on that lonely ridge? A cure, a fantasy, or a slow unraveling? Chapter 1. The illness that sent him west. Before the ballroom chandeliers and ghost stories, there was a coughing man measuring his breath against a Colorado winter. Freelan Stanley knew the sound of his own dying. It arrived in the autumn of 1896, a wet rattle deep in his chest that grew louder each week. The doctors in Newton, Massachusetts, examined him with the practiced detachment of men who had delivered this verdict before. Tuberculosis, consumption, the white plague that killed 1 in 7 Americans before the 20th century turned. They gave him months, perhaps a year if he stayed warm and still. Stanley was 48 years old. He had built a fortune from steam and glass, transforming sunlight into photographs and coal into motion. His hands had designed engines that hissed and churned, automobiles that conquered New England hills without a drop of gasoline. Now those same hands trembled as he buttoned his coat. The irony was not lost on him. A man who built machines to move forward could not outrun the bacteria in his lungs. The medical wisdom of the era prescribed rest, milk, and resignation. Sanitariums filled with the skeletal and the hopeful, drafty rooms where patients waited for death or miracle. Stanley rejected both. He had read the testimonials from Colorado, letters from consumptives who claimed the thin mountain air burned the disease from their bodies. Doctors called it desperation. Stanley called it data. In 1903, he and his wife Flora packed trunks and boarded a train west. The journey took 4 days. Each jostle of the rails felt like punishment. Other passengers moved away from his coughing. Flora held his hand and said nothing. The landscape changed outside the window, farmland giving way to prairie, prairie to foothills, foothills to peaks that scraped clouds. Estes Park was not a town in any traditional sense. It was a valley cupped between mountains, 7,000 feet above the sea, accessible only by rough wagon roads that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter. A scattering of ranches, a few cabins for hunters. Elk outnumbered people 10 to 1. The air was thin enough to make newcomers gasp, cold enough to freeze water in June. Stanley stepped off the stagecoach and filled his lungs. It hurt. Everything hurt. But the air tasted different, dry, clean, empty of the coal smoke and factory soot that choked eastern cities. He rented a cabin and waited to see if the West would save him or simply provide better scenery for his death. The first weeks were agony. His body fought the altitude. Headaches split his skull. His heart hammered at rest. He could walk 50 yards before exhaustion pinned him to a chair. Flora watched him with the careful neutrality of a woman preparing for widowhood. Then, slowly, something shifted. The coughing spells grew shorter. He walked 100 yards, then 200. His appetite returned. Color seeped back into his face. By the end of that first summer, Stanley could hike a mile without stopping. He stood on a ridge above the valley and understood with perfect clarity that he was not going to die. Not yet. But what he also understood, standing in that thin, bright air, was that he could not leave. The moment he descended back to sea level, back to the thick soup of lowland atmosphere, the disease would return. The mountains had given him a reprieve, not a pardon. If he wanted to live, he would have to build a life at 8,000 feet in a place that barely existed. But the question was no longer whether the air had saved him. It was what he would build in gratitude or defiance. Chapter 2: A Fortune Distilled from Fire. Long before the Mountain Hotel, the Stanley name rode on wheels powered by steam and ambition. Freelan Oscar Stanley and his twin brother Francis were born in 1849 in Kingfield, Maine, the sons of a school teacher who believed intelligence could conquer poverty. The brothers were identical in appearance, but complementary in skill. Freelan possessed the mind of an engineer, Francis the instinct of a businessman. Together, they formed a single organism bent on invention. Their first fortune came from light itself. In the 1870s, they perfected a dry plate photographic process that made pictures faster, sharper, cheaper. The Stanley Dry Plate Company sold across America and Europe. Within a decade, they held patents worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. When Eastman Kodak bought them out, the twins walked away with enough money to fund whatever obsession struck next. Steam engines struck next. While the rest of America chased gasoline, the Stanleys built cars that ran on boiling water. The Stanley steamer could reach 60 miles per hour when most automobiles sputtered at 20. It climbed mountains without gears. It ran silent except for the hiss of pressure. Between 1897 and 1902, they hand-built over 200 vehicles, each one a mechanical marvel that cost as much as a house. The wealthy lined up to buy them. Royalty drove them. In 1906, a Stanley steamer set the world land speed record at 127 miles per hour, a mark that stood for years. The brothers proved that steam, not gasoline, was the future of transportation, except it was not. And gasoline engines grew cheaper, more reliable, easier to start on cold mornings. Steam required minutes to build pressure, constant attention to water levels, a careful hand with the burner. By 1909, the market was shifting. The Stanley brothers saw the horizon narrowing. They sold the Stanley Motor Carriage Company for $650,000. In today's terms, adjusted for inflation and economic scale, that sum approaches $17 million. Freelan Stanley walked away at age 59 with more wealth than 3 generations of his family could spend. But wealth without health is just a number to count. And health without purpose is simply waiting. Stanley had both now, and the question that haunted him in that Colorado valley was simpler than any engineering problem he had ever solved. What do you build when you've been given time you never expected to have? His answer came from watching other consumptives arrive in Estes Park. They slept in crude cabins. They ate canned food over campfires. They improved or they did not, but either way they suffered in discomfort. Stanley had spent his career making machines elegant. Why should healing be any different? He decided to build a hotel, not a rustic lodge or a hunting camp, but a palace, a place where the sick could recover in beauty, where wealth and wilderness could coexist, where electric lights and hot water proved that civilization could thrive at any altitude. And he would create a monument to the idea that survival need not be ugly. The decision was equal parts gratitude and ego. Stanley wanted to give back to the place that saved him. He also wanted to prove that a steam engineer could build something permanent, something that would stand long after the last Stanley steamer rusted in a barn. What he did not consider, or perhaps refused to consider, was whether anyone else wanted a luxury hotel in a place accessible only 3 months a year, hours from the nearest railroad, surrounded by wilderness that killed the careless and isolated the rest. He purchased land on a hill overlooking the valley. He hired architects. He drew plans for 140 rooms, and he prepared to pour his automobile fortune into the coldest, loneliest, most beautiful gamble of his life. Chapter 3: The Palace Above the Clouds. At 8,000 feet above sea level, he ordered a hotel bright enough to defy the dark. Construction began in 1907. Stanley demanded the impossible and paid whatever it cost. Lumber had to be hauled by wagon from mills 40 miles away. Stone came from local quarries, cut and shaped by hand. Workers lived in tents through summer and fled before the first snow. The building rose slowly, white clapboard walls against dark pines, a colonial revival dream transported to the edge of the world. The design was deliberate defiance of the landscape. While other mountain lodges embraced rustic log construction, Stanley insisted on Georgian elegance: tall windows, symmetrical facades, a sweeping veranda that wrapped the building like a grand southern porch. He wanted guests to feel they had arrived at a refined estate, not a wilderness outpost. Inside, he installed technology that most Eastern hotels lacked: electric lights in every room, powered by the hotel's own hydroelectric plant, hot and cold running water fed by mountain springs, a telephone switchboard, central steam heat that could warm the building even when snowdrifts reached the second floor. The crown jewel was the music hall, a separate building connected by covered walkway. Stanley had the room designed for perfect acoustics. He installed a pipe organ and a grand piano. He envisioned orchestras, lectures, performances that would prove culture could flourish anywhere if you built the stage for it. 140 guest rooms filled the main building. Each had its own sink. Many had private baths, a luxury even in cities. The furniture was oak and maple, the linens imported, the wallpaper patterned with flowers that never grew at this altitude. Stanley understood that people came to the mountains to escape, but they wanted to escape in comfort. The construction costs climbed past $500,000, nearly $13 million in modern terms. Stanley paid in cash. He supervised every detail personally. His health restored enough that he could stand on scaffolding and argue with carpenters about crown molding. The hotel became his second great invention, his answer to the mountain that had given him life. On June 22, 1909, the Stanley Hotel opened its doors. Guests arrived by stagecoach after an 8-hour journey from the nearest train station. They stepped into a lobby paneled in dark wood, lit by electric chandeliers, warm despite the June chill outside. A doorman took their coats. A clerk handed them brass keys. And for a moment, standing in that bright, impossible space, they could forget they were 3 hours from a doctor and 6 months from easy escape. The first season was a triumph. Wealthy tuberculosis patients booked rooms for weeks. Families from Denver arrived for summer holidays. The orchestra played Brahms and Strauss while guests dined on china plates. At night, the building glowed like a lantern against the black forest, and you could see it from miles away, a declaration that civilization had conquered the wilderness. Stanley stood on the veranda at sunset on those early evenings and breathed air that no longer hurt. His lungs were clear. His fortune was invested in 4 floors of perfection. His wife was happy. The future seemed as solid as the foundation beneath his feet. What he could not see, what no one could see in that golden first summer, was how thin the margin would be, how winter would arrive and lock them in silence, how the isolation that cured him would become the very thing that haunted the building, how decades later the palace of light he built would be remembered not for healing, but for the nightmares it inspired. The hotel was complete. The real test was just beginning. Chapter 4: Luxury in a Landscape of Silence. Guests arrived in silk gowns and tailored suits, only to discover how loud silence can be. The Stanley Hotel operated on a seasonal clock that governed everything. Summer meant salvation. The roads opened in late May, dirt tracks that climbed from lions through steep switchbacks to the valley floor. Stagecoaches ran daily, 12 passengers packed into leather seats, luggage strapped to the roof. The journey from Denver took 10 hours if the weather held, longer if it rained and turned the road to soup. Guests paid premium rates for the privilege. A room cost $4 per night in 1910, roughly $130 in modern terms. Meals were included. So was entertainment. So was the implicit promise that mountain air would restore whatever city living had broken. The hotel filled each summer with 3 distinct populations: the sick, the wealthy, and those who were both. Consumptives arrived pale and thin, carrying doctor's notes and hope. They spent mornings on the veranda, wrapped in blankets, by filling their lungs with air that tasted of pine and snow. Some improved, their coughs quieted, their appetites returned. They stayed for months, writing letters home about miraculous recoveries. Others did not improve. They grew thinner, weaker. When they became too ill to remain, they were loaded onto stagecoaches and sent back down the mountain to die in lower, kinder air. The wealthy came for leisure, not survival. They booked suites and brought trunks of evening wear. They hiked to waterfalls in the morning and danced in the music hall at night. For them, the hotel was a social stage, a place to see and be seen against dramatic scenery. The altitude gave them headaches and shortness of breath, which they treated as amusing inconveniences rather than warnings. The staff numbered 40 during peak season: maids, cooks, bellhops, musicians, groundskeepers. Most lived in quarters behind the main building, small rooms without the luxury afforded to guests. They worked 6 days a week for wages that barely covered expenses. Many were locals, ranchers' children who needed winter income. Others came from Denver, drawn by the chance to serve the wealthy in a place most people would never see. The daily rhythm followed clockwork precision. Breakfast at 7 in the main dining room. White tablecloths and fresh flowers on every table. Mid-morning activities: hiking, horseback riding, fishing in Fall River. Lunch at noon. Afternoon rest for the consumptives, cards and conversation for everyone else. Dinner at 6, formal dress expected, evening entertainment in the music hall, concerts or lectures or dances that lasted until the staff dimmed the lights at 10. It was a curated existence, every hour accounted for, every need anticipated. The hotel functioned as a self-contained world where the only reminder of wilderness was the view from the windows. Then September arrived, and everything changed. The seasonal guests departed by mid-October. The stagecoach service ended. The first heavy snow fell in November and closed the road entirely. What remained was a skeleton crew, a handful of year-round staff, and whoever had chosen or been forced to winter at 8,000 feet. The hotel became a different place entirely. Winter occupancy rarely exceeded a dozen guests. The empty rooms gathered cold. Staff closed entire floors to save on heating costs. The music hall fell silent. The dining room set tables for 6 instead of 60. The road stayed buried under snow until May, which meant no deliveries, no mail, no escape. If you were inside the Stanley Hotel in January, you stayed inside the Stanley Hotel until spring. The isolation was profound. The nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away. The village of Estes Park, such as it was, consisted of a general store and a post office, both closed for the season. If someone fell ill, there was no doctor. If supplies ran low, there was no resupply. The telephone lines went down in storms and stayed down for weeks. Stanley himself rarely wintered at the hotel after the first few years. He and Flora would depart in late autumn, traveling to warmer climates, returning when the spring thaw made the road passable again. He left the building in the care of a manager and skeleton staff, trusting that the structure would survive without him. Those who remained described the winter silence as a living thing. Wind was the only consistent sound, howling down from the peaks, rattling windows, piling snow into drifts that reached the second story. On clear nights, the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. The building creaked and groaned as wood contracted in the cold. Pipes froze despite the heating system. Ice formed on the inside of windows. Guests who stayed through winter were a particular breed. Some were consumptives too ill to travel. Others were writers or artists seeking solitude. A few were simply people with nowhere else to go. They moved through the vast empty building like ghosts themselves, footsteps echoing in hallways designed for crowds. The staff developed routines to fight the monotony. They played cards in the kitchen. They told stories. Some drank more than they should have. Relationships formed and fractured in the forced intimacy of isolation. By February, small grievances became feuds. By March, everyone was brittle, with cabin fever, desperate for the sound of anything other than wind and their own voices. Stanley had built a palace to defy death, but he had not accounted for what happens to the living when you strand them in beauty with nothing but time. The hotel in winter was not a sanctuary. It was a test of how long elegance could mask loneliness, how many empty rooms a person could walk past before they started to feel like the only soul left in the world. And in that isolation, in those long, silent months when the wind was the only visitor, something began to settle into the walls. Not ghosts, not yet, but the residue of too many people confronting too much emptiness. The hotel remembered winter. It learned what happens when you build a cage beautiful enough that people mistake it for freedom. Chapter 5. When healing became performance. Stanley insisted the air had cured him, yet he designed every detail as if illness still waited outside the door. The tuberculosis cure narrative was the hotel's founding myth, the story Stanley told to justify every extravagance. He had arrived dying and departed whole. Therefore, the mountain worked miracles. Therefore, others would experience the same transformation. Therefore, a luxury hotel was not vanity, but medicine. except the medical reality was far more complicated. Tuberculosis treatment in the early 20th century was equal parts science and theater. Doctors prescribed fresh air, rest, and nutrition because they had nothing else to offer. Antibiotics would not exist for another 4 decades. Surgical interventions were brutal and rarely successful. The sanatorium movement that swept America and Europe was built on hope dressed as treatment. Vast institutions where the sick could die in clean, well-ventilated rooms instead of crowded city tenements. The high-altitude cure had some basis in fact. Thin air reduced the oxygen available to tubercle bacilli, slowing their reproduction. Dry climates prevented the spread of infection through moisture. Sunlight provided vitamin D, which supported immune function. But these factors did not cure tuberculosis. They simply created conditions where some patients' immune systems could fight the disease to a standstill. Stanley's recovery fell into this uncertain category. His symptoms improved dramatically during his first summer in Estes Park. But medical records from the era, sparse as they are, suggest his case was never as severe as he claimed. He had a productive cough and weight loss, common symptoms that could indicate early-stage tuberculosis or any number of other respiratory conditions. He never received a definitive diagnosis using the sputum tests available at the time. What Stanley experienced might have been tuberculosis in remission. It might have been chronic bronchitis exacerbated by Newton's coal smoke. It might have been psychosomatic improvement driven by belief and clean living. Medical historians who have examined his case note that he lived another 37 years after his supposed cure, dying at age 91 from causes unrelated to lung disease. True tuberculosis patients of that era rarely survived so long, but Stanley never questioned the narrative. He believed the mountain had saved him, and that belief shaped everything he built. The hotel became a temple to the idea that nature, properly packaged, could defeat death. He marketed the Stanley Hotel explicitly as a health resort. Brochures mailed to eastern cities promised rest, recovery, and rejuvenation. Advertisements in medical journals targeted doctors who might recommend the hotel to wealthy patients. The language was careful, avoiding outright medical claims, but the implication was clear. Come here to heal. Guests arrived carrying that expectation. They believed the altitude would cure them. They believed the building itself, with its electric lights and steam heat, enhanced the healing properties of the air. They believed because Stanley believed, and his conviction was infectious. The hotel's design reinforced the illusion of control over illness. Every modern convenience suggested mastery over nature. Hot water on demand meant you need not suffer the cold. Electric lights meant you need not fear the dark. Gourmet meals meant you need not endure invalid food. The building promised that wealth could purchase not just comfort, but survival. Stanley hired a house physician, a doctor who lived on site during summer months and provided consultations to guests. The physician had no special training in tuberculosis. He could offer morphine for pain, tonics for appetite, advice about rest and fresh air. But his primary function was reassurance. His presence suggested medical legitimacy, a professional seal on Stanley's healing claims. Some guests did improve during their stays. They gained weight. Their coughs subsided. They returned home declaring themselves cured. But how many of those recoveries stemmed from the altitude versus the rest, the nutrition, the escape from stressful lives, remains unknowable. The hotel became a stage where improvement could be attributed to the setting, rather than the complex interplay of factors that govern chronic disease. others deteriorated. The altitude that helped some patients destroyed others. Thin air strained weak hearts. The cold aggravated fragile lungs. Guests who arrived hopeful left on stretchers, rushed back to lower elevations in desperate attempts to save them. These failures were not advertised. They did not appear in brochures. But staff remembered them, the rooms where people had coughed blood into handkerchiefs, cheered the mornings when the doctor was summoned and could do nothing but ease the dying into morphine sleep. Stanley himself became a walking advertisement, proof that the cure worked. He spent summers at the hotel, vigorous and active well into his 70s. He hiked. He drove his steam cars up mountain roads. He played billiards with guests and told stories about his recovery. His very presence validated the myth, but there was something performative about it, and something that suggested he was not entirely convinced. He kept building, adding wings, improving systems, as if the hotel's perfection could guarantee continued health. He monitored every detail obsessively, from the quality of bed linens to the temperature of bathwater. It was the behavior of a man who believed that if he stopped controlling the environment, the disease might return. The hotel became his talisman, his bargain with mortality. As long as the building stood perfect and beautiful, as long as guests arrived and departed praising the air, he could believe he had conquered death rather than simply postponed it. And perhaps that was the real purpose all along. Not to cure others, but to prove to himself that survival was earned through will and wealth and engineering brilliance. The hotel was not medicine. It was a monument to the idea that a man could build his way out of dying if he built grandly enough. Whether that made it a lie or simply a very expensive prayer depends on how you define salvation. Chapter 6: The Winter That Inspired a Nightmare. In 1974, a struggling writer checked into room 217 as the season closed around him. Stephen King arrived at the Stanley Hotel on a cool September evening with his wife Tabitha and their infant son. They were driving from Boulder to Portland, a long haul across western states, and needed a place to stop. The hotel was about to close for the season. The summer guests had departed. The staff was packing china and draining pipes. King checked in because it was there, because it was cheap in the off-season, because he had no idea what the building would give him. Room 217 was on the second floor, a corner room with windows facing the mountains. The furniture was old but maintained. The radiator clanked. The wind rattled the glass. King unpacked their bags and went downstairs for dinner. The dining room was empty except for them. One table set, one waiter serving. The vast room designed for 100 guests echoed with the sound of silverware on china. King ate quickly, unsettled by the silence, by the feeling of being watched by empty chairs. That night, he had the dream. He was in the hotel, wandering corridors that stretched longer than they should. His son was running ahead of him, small legs pumping, laughing. Then the laughter changed pitch, became screaming. King chased through the halls but could not catch him. Doors opened onto rooms filled with dark shapes. The building itself seemed to breathe, walls contracting, trapping him in a maze that wanted his child. He woke gasping, heart hammering, the room cold despite the radiator's heat. Beside him, Tabitha slept. The baby slept. Outside, wind moved through pines. King lay in the dark and understood he had been given a story. He spent the next hours walking the hotel. The halls were empty, lit by dim emergency lights. His footsteps echoed. He tried doors and found them locked. He rode the elevator, an old cage lift that groaned between floors. He stood in the lobby and imagined it full of ghosts, not the sheet and chain variety, but the ghosts of people who had come here desperate and stayed too long. By morning, he had the bones of what would become The Shining. A family trapped in an isolated hotel, a father descending into madness, a child with psychic abilities. The building itself as a character, a hungry thing that fed on human weakness. He checked out and drove to Portland, but the story stayed with him. The novel took 3 years to write. Published in 1977, it became an immediate bestseller. Critics praised its psychological horror, the way King turned isolation into violence, the way he made a building feel alive and malicious. Readers devoured it. When Stanley Kubrick adapted it into a film in 1980, the imagery became iconic. The empty hallways, the blood flooding from elevators, the typewriter pages repeating the same sentence into madness. The Stanley Hotel was never named in the book or film. King changed the setting to the Overlook Hotel, a fictional property in a fictional location. But everyone knew the details were too specific, the isolation too precise. King gave interviews where he described his stay, the empty dining room, the dream of his son in danger. The connection was made, and the hotel's identity changed forever. Paranormal investigators descended first. They came with electromagnetic field detectors and infrared cameras, seeking proof that the building was genuinely haunted. They reported cold spots in the fourth-floor hallway. They recorded voices in empty rooms. They claimed to photograph apparitions in the windows. Some of it was wishful thinking, pattern recognition in static. Some might have been genuine anomaly. The fourth floor drew particular attention. Originally designed as servants' quarters, it had lower ceilings and narrower halls. Guests reported feeling watched. They described a presence in room 418, a sense of someone standing just out of sight. A few claimed to see a man in old-fashioned clothing, a caretaker perhaps, who vanished when approached. Room 217, where King had slept, became the most requested room. Guests booked it specifically, hoping for nightmares or visions. Some reported vivid dreams, others felt nothing. The hotel management, recognizing opportunity, began offering ghost tours. The scientific explanations were straightforward. Old buildings settle, wood expands and contracts with temperature. Wind creates pressure differentials that slam doors and rattle windows. The altitude causes mild hypoxia, which can trigger hallucinations or heighten suggestibility. Isolation amplifies anxiety. Alcohol, common among guests seeking courage for ghost hunting, distorts perception. Add these factors together, place them in a building with a famous horror connection, and the mind does the rest. People expect ghosts. They interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirming their expectations. A creaking floorboard becomes footsteps. A draft becomes a presence. The hotel does not need to be haunted to feel haunted. But there are stories that resist easy explanation. Multiple guests, unaware of each other's accounts, describe the same woman in period dress standing at the end of the hall. Staff who have worked the hotel for decades admit to avoiding certain rooms after dark, not from fear of ghosts, but from an uncomfortable feeling they cannot name. Audio recordings made in empty rooms sometimes capture what sounds like children laughing or music playing, faint and distorted. King himself returned to the hotel years later for a television adaptation of his novel. He walked the halls again, older now, successful beyond what that desperate young writer could have imagined. He was asked if he believed the place was haunted. His answer was careful. "The hotel," he said, "had a memory. It remembered everyone who had passed through it, everyone who had suffered or hoped or feared within its walls." In whether that memory constituted a haunting or simply a very powerful atmosphere was a question he left unanswered. What cannot be disputed is that one night in September 1974 changed the hotel's trajectory. Stanley had built a palace to defeat death through healing. King transformed it into a monument to the terror of isolation. Both men saw the same building. Both understood it as a place where something fundamental about human fragility was exposed. The hotel that had once promised cure now promised nightmare. Whether that was desecration or simply evolution, whether it honored Stanley's legacy or betrayed it, depended entirely on whether you believed a building's purpose was determined by its creator or by the stories people told about it afterward. Either way, the Palace of Light had learned to live in shadow. Chapter 7: Fame that Rewrote the Past. After the novel, guests no longer asked about the orchestra, but about ghosts. The Stanley Hotel entered the 1980s in financial decline. The glory years of the tuberculosis cure movement had ended decades earlier. Antibiotics made high-altitude resorts obsolete. Post-war tourism favored ski resorts and national parks over isolated historic hotels. Estes Park had grown into a legitimate town, gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park, but most visitors drove through to hike, not to stay in a hotel that charged premium rates for history. Occupancy during the late 70s averaged 40%. The building required constant expensive maintenance. The roof leaked. The plumbing, installed in 1909, broke down regularly. The electrical system was outdated and dangerous. Ownership had changed hands multiple times, each new investor hoping to restore profitability, each failing and selling at a loss. Then The Shining arrived and everything changed. The novel sold over 3 million copies in its first 5 years. The Kubrick film, despite mixed initial reviews, became a cultural landmark. By 1985, the story had entered public consciousness as a definitive work of horror. And everyone knew it was based, however loosely, on the Stanley Hotel. Visitors began arriving specifically because of the connection. They booked rooms and walked the halls looking for the inspiration behind King's terror. They asked staff about ghosts. They took photographs of empty corridors, hoping to capture anomalies. The hotel, which had spent decades marketing history and elegance, suddenly had something more valuable: notoriety. Management recognized the opportunity. In 1983, they launched the first official ghost tour. For an additional fee, guests could join a guide who led them through the building, sharing paranormal stories and pointing out haunted hotspots. The tours sold out immediately. The numbers tell the transformation story with brutal clarity. In 1979, the year before the Kubrick film released, the hotel hosted approximately 12,000 overnight guests and generated $600,000 in revenue. By 1987, annual visitors exceeded 35,000 with revenue surpassing $2.1 million. The ghost tours alone brought in an additional $300,000 per year, and tourism directly attributable to the Shining connection increased occupancy from 40% to 78% during peak months. The hotel was saved by horror, but the rescue came at a cost. Stanley's original vision, the elegant health resort where consumptives could recover in beauty, was buried under a narrative of madness and murder. The music hall, once home to Brahms and lectures on art history, hosted seances and paranormal conferences. The dining room where tuberculosis patients had taken therapeutic meals became a gathering spot for ghost hunters sharing electromagnetic field readings. The marketing shifted entirely. Brochures that once emphasized mountain air and historic architecture now featured shadowy figures in windows and testimonials from guests who had experienced unexplainable events. The hotel's website, launched in the mid-90s, dedicated entire sections to hauntings. Room 217 was marketed as the most haunted room, available for booking at premium rates. Some longtime staff resented the transformation. They remembered when the hotel was simply a historic building, when guests came for the views and the legacy. Now they were expected to share ghost stories, whether they believed them or not. The narratives became standardized, repeated on every tour, embellished over time until fact and fiction merged into a single performance. Freelan Stanley's descendants watched the evolution with mixed feelings. On one hand, the horror connection saved the building their ancestor had poured his fortune into. Without The Shining, the hotel might have been demolished, subdivided, lost to time. On the other hand, Stanley was now a footnote in his own story. Visitors knew Stephen King. They knew Jack Torrance and the Overlook Hotel. They rarely knew anything about the consumptive engineer who had built the actual place. Historical preservation became complicated. The hotel had always maintained its early 20th century character, but now every restoration decision carried the weight of maintaining atmosphere for ghost tours. Original furnishings were preserved not just for historic value, but because age enhanced the eerie aesthetic. Modern updates were hidden, implemented in ways that did not disturb the carefully curated feeling of decay and timelessness. The hotel became two places simultaneously. By day, it functioned as a legitimate historic hotel, hosting weddings and conferences, serving as a respectable business. By night, it transformed into a haunted attraction, a stage where paying customers could experience vicarious terror in controlled doses. This duality required constant calibration. Management had to satisfy guests who wanted authentic history and guests who wanted to be scared. They had to maintain standards of hospitality while encouraging just enough unease to justify the ghost tour tickets. It was a performance that never ended, a balance between honoring the past and exploiting it. Critics argued the hotel had sold its soul. Historians complained that supernatural tourism trivialized the real history of tuberculosis treatment, the genuine suffering of patients who had come desperate for healing. Paranormal skeptics accused the hotel of fraud, its manufacturing ghostly encounters to boost revenue. But the hotel survived, and survival, as Stanley himself would have understood, requires adaptation. He had transformed automobile money into a mountain palace. The hotel transformed horror fiction into financial salvation. Both were acts of reinvention, turning one kind of capital into another. The question that lingered, unspoken in management meetings and Preservation Society debates, was whether a building could maintain its integrity while becoming a commodity. Whether fame rescued or ruined. Whether the stories told about a place became more real than the place itself. The Stanley Hotel in the 21st century was profitable, iconic, internationally recognized. It was also something Stanley never intended. Whether he would have approved or been horrified remains unknowable. But the building he created to fight death had learned to survive by embracing the things that frighten us most. and perhaps that was its own kind of cure. Chapter 8: Between Haunting and Marketing. Management learned that fear sells, but not every creak needs a spirit attached to it. The paranormal narrative required maintenance. Ghost stories, like any product, needed to evolve to stay compelling. The hotel employed a paranormal coordinator by the late 1990s, by someone whose job was to research the building's history, catalog reported encounters, and train tour guides in effective storytelling. The most repeated story involved Freelan Stanley, Freelan's wife. Guests and staff claimed to hear piano music late at night coming from the music hall. When investigated, the hall was always empty, the piano untouched. The music was described as classical, elegant, the kind Flora herself might have played during the hotel's early years when she hosted gatherings for summer guests. The phenomenon had a pedestrian explanation. The hotel sits in a valley where sound carries strangely. Music from nearby buildings or cars on the main road can echo off the mountains and funnel toward the hotel. The architecture itself creates acoustic anomalies, old pipes and ductwork that hum at certain frequencies, wind that moans through gaps in windows. These sounds, and heard late at night by tired guests primed to expect ghosts, become phantom piano music. But the Flora story persisted because it was romantic, non-threatening, exactly the kind of ghost tourists wanted. A genteel woman playing music in a building she loved was far more appealing than anonymous creaking. Room 418 presented a more unsettling narrative. Multiple guests over decades reported waking to see a man standing at the foot of their bed. He was described consistently: tall, a weathered face, wearing clothes from the early 1900s. Some saw him only for a second before he vanished. Others watched him walk across the room and disappear through a wall. A few claimed he spoke, always the same phrase: "You should leave." The hotel's records showed no deaths in room 418. No former employee matched the description. Paranormal investigators who spent nights there with cameras and recorders captured nothing conclusive. But the reports continued, inconsistent enough that staff began to believe something, whether supernatural or psychological, was happening. The explanation might be sleep paralysis, a phenomenon where the brain wakes while the body remains in REM sleep. Sufferers often hallucinate figures in the room, experience feelings of dread, and are unable to move. High altitude can disrupt sleep patterns, making paralysis more likely. Add the expectation of ghosts, and the mind fills in the details with a period-appropriate specter. Or perhaps the room genuinely retained some impression of a former occupant. Paranormal theory suggests traumatic events or strong emotions can imprint on a location, creating residual hauntings that replay like recordings. Room 418 was servants' quarters originally, where staff lived in cramped conditions, working brutal hours for minimal pay. If resentment and exhaustion could leave a mark, that room would qualify. The hotel walked a careful line between these explanations. On tours, guides shared the reported encounters, but also acknowledged possible rational causes. They never claimed definitive proof of ghosts, but encouraged guests to decide for themselves. This approach satisfied both believers and skeptics, allowing everyone to leave feeling their worldview had been respected. The business model worked. By 2010, the hotel was hosting over 70,000 visitors annually. Ghost tours ran every night during peak season, and sometimes multiple tours simultaneously. The hotel partnered with paranormal television shows, allowing crews to film overnight investigations. Episodes featuring the Stanley Hotel generated publicity spikes, increased bookings, and further cemented its reputation. But responsible storytelling became increasingly difficult. The more famous the hotel became for hauntings, the more guests arrived expecting and therefore experiencing supernatural encounters. Staff heard wild claims, demonic possessions, physical attacks by spirits, messages from the dead. Most were obvious fabrications or misinterpretations, but a few were genuinely disturbing, people who seemed traumatized by whatever they believed had happened. The hotel implemented policies to protect vulnerable guests. They stopped marketing the fourth floor as haunted after a guest had a panic attack and accused staff of deliberately scaring her. And they required paranormal tour participants to sign waivers acknowledging the experience might be unsettling. They trained staff to recognize when someone was genuinely distressed versus simply excited. The ethical questions multiplied. Was it responsible to encourage ghost beliefs when some people might take them too seriously? Was the hotel obligated to debunk claims or simply present information neutrally? Where was the line between entertainment and exploitation? Historians and preservationists also raised concerns. The focus on ghosts overshadowed the hotel's legitimate historical significance. Freelan Stanley's engineering achievements, the social history of tuberculosis treatment, the architecture of early 20th century resort design, all these were more interesting and educational than ghost stories. But they did not sell tickets the way fear did. The hotel attempted to balance both narratives. They created a historical museum in the basement, displaying photographs of early guests, Stanley's personal belongings, and information about the tuberculosis sanatorium movement. They offered daytime historic tours that avoided paranormal topics entirely. But the ghost tours remained the primary draw, the thing people traveled across the country to experience. Staff developed their own relationship with the building's alleged hauntings. Long-time employees admitted they had experienced things they could not explain, but were reluctant to call them ghosts. Doors that opened on their own, objects moved overnight, the sense of being watched in empty rooms. They had learned to coexist with whatever was happening, treating it as part of the building's personality rather than evidence of the supernatural. One housekeeper, who had worked the hotel for 18 years, put it simply. The building was old and full of memories. Whether those memories manifested as actual hauntings or simply as atmosphere did not matter much when you were alone on the fourth floor at 3 in the morning. Either way, you felt them. The Stanley Hotel in the 21st century existed in a strange space between history and mythology, reality and performance. It was a genuine historic landmark that made its money scaring people. It was a business that traded on ambiguity, never confirming or denying, always leaving room for belief. Whether this represented the corruption of Stanley's vision or its natural evolution was a question with no clear answer. He had built a palace to fight death. His successors had transformed it into a place where people came to flirt with the idea of death, to feel the thrill of fear in a controlled environment where nothing could actually hurt them. Both versions asked guests to confront mortality. Stanley offered healing. The modern hotel offered adrenaline. Perhaps the only real difference was honesty about what they were selling. Chapter 9. The Night the Mountain tested it again. Decades after Stanley's death, a flood tore through Estes Park and threatened to silence the hotel for good. July 20th, 1982. Rain began falling over the Front Range of the Rockies shortly before 6 in the evening. It was not the gentle summer shower that locals expected. It was a deluge, water dropping from clouds in solid sheets, overwhelming the ground's ability to absorb it. Within an hour, creeks that normally ran ankle-deep swelled to 10 feet. Lawn Dam, a small earthwork structure in the mountains above Estes Park, failed catastrophically. Millions of gallons of water roared down into the valley. The Stanley Hotel stood on a hill, which saved it. The flood destroyed downtown Estes Park, tearing buildings from foundations, crushing cars, killing 3 people. Water surged through the streets at 15 feet deep, carrying debris and destruction. But the hotel, elevated above the chaos, watched. The building itself suffered minimal direct damage, but the town's infrastructure was devastated. Roads washed out. The water system broke. Power lines came down. For weeks, Estes Park was accessible only by emergency vehicles. The hotel closed temporarily, the first unplanned closure in its history. Repair costs across the valley exceeded $31 million in 1982 terms, roughly $96 million adjusted for inflation. The Stanley Hotel contributed funds to rebuild downtown, recognizing that its survival depended on the town's recovery. Guests would not come if there was no town to support them. The flood was only the most dramatic in a series of crises that tested the hotel's endurance. The building that Stanley had constructed to last forever required constant, expensive intervention to actually survive. In 1973, the roof needed complete replacement at a cost of $280,000, approximately $1.9 million in current terms. In 1991, the electrical system was rewired to meet modern code, a project that took 6 months and cost over $400,000. In 2005, the entire plumbing system was replaced, in an undertaking so complex that sections of the hotel had to be closed for nearly a year, while workers removed lead pipes and installed modern materials. That project exceeded $1.3 million. The heating system, Stanley's pride, became a maintenance nightmare. The original steam boilers lasted into the 1960s, but required parts that were no longer manufactured. Replacing them with modern equipment while maintaining the period radiators took engineering creativity and significant money. By 2015, the hotel had invested over $2 million in heating upgrades alone. Historic preservation added another layer of expense. The Stanley Hotel received designation as a National Historic Landmark, which brought prestige but also strict regulations. Every renovation required approval from preservation boards. Materials had to match original specifications. Changes to the exterior were essentially forbidden. This meant repairs often cost 3 to 5 times what they would in a modern building. The business model had to evolve to support these costs. The hotel diversified revenue streams. They hosted weddings, corporate retreats, film shoots. They licensed the Stanley name for merchandise, selling everything from ghost hunting kits to branded whiskey. They raised room rates steadily, and charging premium prices justified by history and notoriety. By 2020, before the pandemic, the hotel generated approximately $11 million in annual revenue. Operating costs absorbed $7 million of that, leaving $4 million for maintenance, upgrades, and profit. It was a sustainable model, but barely. One major unforeseen expense could tip the balance. The pandemic nearly broke that balance. When travel stopped in March 2020, and the hotel closed entirely for the first time since the flood. Months passed with zero revenue while fixed costs like insurance and basic maintenance continued. The building emptied, and staff who had worked there for decades were laid off. The hotel survived by pivoting to local events, ghost tours for Colorado residents, small gatherings that complied with restrictions. When travel resumed, pent-up demand brought visitors flooding back. But the financial stress had been real, a reminder that even iconic landmarks are fragile. Natural disasters remained a constant threat. The 1982 flood was not an isolated event. Wildfires threatened the valley in 2012 and again in 2020. Drought weakened trees, creating fuel for catastrophic burns. The hotel implemented fire suppression systems and maintained defensible space, spending hundreds of thousands on prevention. But if fire reached the building, with its old wood construction and remote location, survival was unlikely. Climate change added new uncertainties. Winters were becoming less predictable. Snowpack that once reliably closed roads and created a defined off-season was diminishing. Summer temperatures were rising, stressing the building's limited air conditioning. The landscape Stanley had chosen for its healing air was changing in ways that challenged the hotel's ability to function. The building's age was also simply catching up. Wood siding needed replacement. Windows, even those replaced in recent decades, were failing. The foundation, poured over a century ago, showed cracks. Each inspection revealed new problems, new expenses. The hotel was like an elderly patient requiring ever more complex care to remain functional. Yet it endured. Through floods and fires, economic collapse, and pandemic, the palace above the clouds refused to fall. Partly, this was luck. Partly, it was the dedication of people who loved the building and fought to preserve it. Partly, it was the revenue generated by its dark tourism appeal. But endurance came at a cost. The hotel that stood in 2025 was not the hotel Stanley built. It had been rebuilt so many times in so many pieces that almost nothing original remained except the bones. Like the ship of Theseus, the philosophical paradox about whether an object remains the same when all its parts have been replaced. The Stanley Hotel was both itself and a copy. The question facing its stewards was how long that endurance could continue. Historic preservation required money. Money required visitors. Visitors required the ghost story. The ghost story risked overshadowing the history. And without the history, what exactly were they preserving? The palace had survived the mountain's tests. Whether it could survive its own fame remained to be seen. Chapter 10. The Man Behind the Myth. Freelan Stanley did not live to see haunted tours, but he did see his lungs clear in mountain air. Stanley died on October 2, 1940, in Newton, Massachusetts, the same town where he had received his tuberculosis diagnosis 44 years earlier. He was 91 years old. His lungs were clear. His mind was sharp. He simply wore out, the way machines do when they run long enough. The obituaries focused on his inventions, the steam car, the photographic dry plate process, his contributions to American industry. The hotel in Colorado merited a paragraph, described as a successful business venture and mountain retreat. Nothing about ghosts, nothing about horror novels yet to be written, just a wealthy inventor who had built something beautiful in the place that gave him extra decades. Stanley's final years were spent in comfort, but not idleness. He and Flora divided time between Newton and the hotel, though they rarely stayed through winter. He continued tinkering with steam engines, even as gasoline automobiles made them obsolete. He held patents until the end, always looking for the next improvement, the next elegant solution to mechanical problems. His relationship with the hotel in its later years was affectionate but distant. He had hired competent managers. The business ran without his daily oversight. He visited to inspect repairs, to ensure standards were maintained, to walk the halls and remember what he had built when death felt imminent. Letters from his final decade reveal a man satisfied with his life's work. He had conquered tuberculosis, whether through mountain air or sheer will. He had made a fortune from inventions that moved the world forward. He had built something permanent in a landscape of impermanence. What more could an engineer ask? Flora survived him by 3 years, dying in 1943. The couple had no children, which meant the hotel passed to distant relatives and eventually out of family control entirely. Stanley had hoped the building would remain a family legacy, but he was practical enough to understand that ownership mattered less than survival. He never knew about Stephen King, never knew his palace of healing would become synonymous with madness, never knew that room 217 would be booked years in advance by people seeking nightmares. The irony would have amused or appalled him, perhaps both. What Stanley did know, in his final years, was that he had built something that outlived him. The hotel stood on its ridge above Estes Park, white walls glowing against dark pines, exactly as he had designed it. Guests still arrived each summer. The orchestra still played. The building fulfilled its purpose. The tuberculosis cure narrative, his founding myth, remained intact during his lifetime. He died believing he had created a sanctuary where others could experience the healing he had found. Whether that belief was medically accurate or simply a comforting story he told himself, he never questioned it. Photographs from his later years show a tall, lean man with a steady gaze. He aged well, retained his posture and vigor far longer than most men of his generation. He looked like someone who had won a bet against death and never let himself forget the victory. His funeral was well attended, but not spectacular. He had outlived most of his contemporaries. The steam car enthusiasts came, collectors who still drove Stanley steamers and considered him a pioneer. A few hotel staff made the trip from Colorado. Flora's family gathered. He was buried in Newton, far from the mountains that had saved him. The hotel received a telegram announcing his death, and his staff held a moment of silence. Guests who were staying at the time likely had no idea the founder had passed. The building continued operating without interruption, which is perhaps what Stanley would have wanted. No ghost stories emerged about Stanley himself. Unlike Flora, whose piano playing supposedly echoes through the music hall, Freelan left no reported hauntings. If his spirit lingered, it kept quiet, watching from some invisible vantage as his creation transformed into something he never intended. The historical record is sparse on Stanley's interior life. He was an engineer, not a poet. His letters discuss mechanics and business, not emotions or philosophy. We know what he built, but can only guess why, beyond the obvious reasons of survival and profit. Did he build the hotel out of gratitude, a gift to the mountain that gave him life? Or was it defiance, a declaration that illness would not limit him? Was it legacy, the childless man's need to create something permanent? Was it simply what wealthy men did in that era, transforming personal experience into commercial enterprise? Likely it was all of these, a tangle of motivations that even Stanley himself could not have separated. What matters is that he built it, and in building it, he created a space where human fragility could be confronted in comfort, where the fear of death could be soothed by elegance and electric light. He died not knowing whether that was enough, whether a building, however beautiful, could truly defeat the darkness he feared. whether his sanctuary would endure or crumble, whether anyone would remember him as anything more than a name attached to a haunted hotel. The answer, decades after his death, is complicated. He is remembered, but not as he imagined. His hotel endures, but not as he intended. His legacy is secured, but transformed beyond recognition. Perhaps that is the fate of all builders. You create what you can with the time and resources available, and then you surrender it to the future. The future does what it wants. The palace becomes a stage for ghosts. The cure becomes a nightmare. The monument to life becomes a meditation on death. Stanley would have understood that, in the end. He built machines, and machines inevitably outlive their creators. In serving purposes the inventor never dreamed of, the hotel was his final machine, the most complex and personal he ever designed. It is still running. Chapter 11. Rooms filled with other people's dreams. Today, couples marry where consumptives once sought breath, and writers once feared their own thoughts. The Stanley Hotel in the 21st century is a thriving business built on layers of contradictory narratives. It hosts approximately 75,000 overnight guests annually. Another 150,000 visit for tours, events, weddings, or meals without staying the night. Revenue approaches $14 million per year, placing it among the most successful historic hotels in America. The wedding business alone accounts for over $2 million annually. The hotel hosts an average of 120 weddings per year, concentrated in summer and fall months. Couples exchange vows on the veranda overlooking the mountains, reception dinners in the ballroom where tuberculosis patients once gathered for therapeutic entertainment. The marketing carefully balances romance and history, emphasizing elegance while downplaying the ghost stories enough not to spook nervous brides. Corporate retreats bring in another $1.5 million. Companies book the entire hotel for team-building exercises, leadership conferences, strategy sessions. They use the music hall for presentations, the dining room for catered meals. The paranormal element is optional, a fun team activity rather than the main draw. The hotel becomes whatever clients need: historic venue, mountain retreat, or mildly spooky backdrop. The ghost tours remain the signature offering. 5 different tour options are available, from a basic hour-long walking tour to overnight paranormal investigations that run from dusk to dawn. Prices range from $25 for the basic tour to $499 for the full-night investigation with paranormal equipment provided. The tours sell out months in advance during peak season. Merchandise sales add another $300,000 annually. The hotel gift shop stocks everything from historical books to ghost hunting equipment to whiskey branded with the Stanley name. Guests purchase t-shirts, coffee mugs, playing cards, and all featuring images of the white colonial facade. The Stanley Hotel has become a brand as much as a place. Film and television production generates unpredictable but significant revenue. The hotel charges location fees for shoots, ranging from $5,000 for a day of exterior filming to $50,000 for multi-day productions that require closing sections of the building. Paranormal television shows return regularly, and each episode bringing a spike in bookings as viewers decide they want to experience what they watched. But beneath the commercial success lies the constant challenge of preservation. The hotel operates under National Historic Landmark status, which restricts modifications and requires approval for even minor changes. Every improvement must balance modern functionality with historic authenticity. Recent renovation projects illustrate the complexity. In 2018, the hotel undertook a $3 million modernization of guest rooms. The goal was to add amenities contemporary travelers expect, things like USB charging ports and improved Wi-Fi, while maintaining the early 20th century aesthetic. The work required custom solutions, hiding modern technology inside period-appropriate furniture, running new cables through walls in ways that did not damage historic fabric. The bathrooms presented particular challenges. Many original rooms had shared baths or minimal plumbing. Converting them to full private baths meant reconfiguring layouts, adding plumbing where none existed, installing modern fixtures that looked historically appropriate. The cost per room exceeded $40,000, far above typical hotel renovation budgets. Accessibility improvements added another layer of expense and complexity. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires public buildings to accommodate wheelchairs and mobility limitations. But the hotel was built in 1909 with narrow doorways, steep stairs, and no elevators except the single original cage lift that barely fits 2 people. Installing ramps and widening doorways without destroying historic character required engineering creativity and preservation board negotiations. The accessibility upgrades, still ongoing, are projected to cost over $5 million total. The heating and cooling system remains a perpetual challenge. The original steam radiators provide inadequate heat in winter and no cooling in summer. Adding central air conditioning would require ductwork that would destroy ceilings and walls. The hotel has instead installed individual units in guest rooms, hidden behind custom cabinetry. It is an imperfect solution that costs more to operate than centralized systems, but preserves the building's integrity. Fire safety upgrades, mandated by modern building codes, required installing sprinklers throughout the building. The sprinkler pipes had to be routed through walls and ceilings in ways that minimized visual impact. Smoke detectors, emergency lighting, and exit signs had to be integrated discreetly. The fire safety system cost over $1 million and took 2 years to implement. The hotel employs over 200 people during peak season, dropping to about 70 during winter months. Wages and benefits account for approximately 45% of operating costs. Training staff to handle both hospitality standards and historic preservation requirements is an ongoing challenge. Housekeepers must clean rooms without damaging antique fixtures. Maintenance workers must repair systems using methods that do not compromise historic materials. The preservation versus modernization tension appears in every decision. Guests expect Wi-Fi and flat-screen televisions. Preservationists insist on maintaining historic plaster and original light fixtures. The hotel must satisfy both, creating an experience that feels authentically old while functioning with contemporary reliability. The pandemic forced reevaluation of many practices. In contactless check-in, mobile room keys, and enhanced sanitization protocols were implemented rapidly. Some were temporary measures that ended when travel resumed. Others became permanent, incorporated into the hotel's operations because they improved efficiency or guest satisfaction. The ghost tour business faced particular scrutiny. Social distancing made group tours difficult. Some guests feared enclosed spaces and recirculated air. The hotel adapted by offering smaller tour groups, in outdoor ghost stories on the veranda, and virtual tours for people who wanted the experience without travel. The virtual tours, surprisingly, generated significant revenue from people around the world who were curious but unable to visit in person. The hotel's position in Estes Park remains symbiotic but occasionally tense. The town has grown into a tourist destination in its own right, with hundreds of shops, restaurants, and outdoor recreation businesses. The Stanley Hotel is the most famous landmark, but it is no longer the only draw. Town leaders sometimes complain that the hotel's ghost tourism overshadows Estes Park's natural beauty and family-friendly offerings. But economically, the relationship is clear. The hotel employs hundreds, attracts visitors who spend money throughout the valley, and provides a marquee destination that raises the town's profile. When the hotel thrives, Estes Park benefits. When the hotel struggles, and the entire community feels it. Looking forward, the hotel faces questions about sustainability, both environmental and economic. Climate change threatens the mountain ecosystem Stanley chose for its healing properties. Longer fire seasons, unpredictable snowfall, and rising temperatures stress infrastructure designed for a different climate. The hotel has implemented green initiatives, from solar panels to water conservation systems, but remains fundamentally a century-old building with energy efficiency far below modern standards. The demographic of visitors is also shifting. Baby boomers who remember reading The Shining when it was published are aging out of travel. Younger generations know the Kubrick film or the 2016 miniseries, but the cultural resonance is different. The hotel must constantly refresh its narrative to remain relevant without abandoning the core story that made it famous. The question asked in management meetings and Preservation Society conferences is how long the current model is sustainable. Can a building survive indefinitely on ghost stories and nostalgia? What happens when the generation that made The Shining iconic is gone? Will the hotel need to reinvent itself again, as it has reinvented itself multiple times already? The Stanley Hotel has always been whatever it needed to be to survive. A tuberculosis sanatorium, an elegant resort, a horror icon, a wedding venue. Perhaps it will become something else entirely, some new narrative we cannot yet imagine. But for now, it stands on its ridge above Estes Park, white walls glowing, windows reflecting mountains, filled with other people's dreams and nightmares. The building Stanley erected to fight death has learned to live by helping others confront their own fears in controlled, commodified doses. It is not what he intended, but it is undeniably alive. Chapter 12. What isolation builds in us. Stand alone on the veranda at dusk, and the mountains feel less like scenery and more like witnesses. The story of the Stanley Hotel is ultimately a story about human attempts to control the uncontrollable. Freelan Stanley tried to engineer his way out of death. Stephen King tried to write his way out of fear. In every guest who has ever climbed to 8,000 feet searching for ghosts or healing or simply something different than the life they left behind has been trying to escape or confront some fundamental uncertainty. The building itself becomes a mirror for those attempts. It reflects back whatever you bring to it. If you arrive seeking ghosts, the creaking floorboards become footsteps. If you come for history, the lobby becomes a window into tuberculosis treatment and early 20th century resort culture. If you just want a wedding venue with good views, it provides that too. This multiplicity is the hotel's genius and its curse. By becoming so many things to so many people, it has lost the singular identity Stanley gave it. But by refusing a single identity, it has survived when countless other grand hotels have not. Consider what has been lost: the orchestras that played nightly, the consumptives who arrived desperate and departed, if they departed at all. The winter silence before fear became entertainment. The belief that architecture and altitude could cure disease. Stanley's conviction that elegance mattered, that beauty was medicine, that a man could build permanence. Now consider what remains. A building that still takes your breath, whether from altitude or architecture. Rooms that still offer refuge from whatever drives people to mountains. A business that employs hundreds and anchors a town. A cultural touchstone that inspired one of horror's defining works. A preservation success story in an era when historic buildings fall to development pressure daily. The tension between loss and survival, between what was intended and what emerged, defines the hotel's legacy. Stanley would not recognize what his palace has become, but he would recognize that it endures, and for an engineer, endurance might be victory enough. The isolation that cured Stanley and terrified King is still there, less extreme but present. Estes Park is no longer hours from civilization, but the mountains still surround you, still remind you how small human endeavor appears against geologic time. The hotel still sits on its ridge, still requires effort to reach, still separates you from the familiar. Perhaps that is why people keep coming. In an age of constant connection and curated experience, the Stanley Hotel offers genuine solitude if you want it. The modern world has made isolation rare. We can reach anyone, anytime, from anywhere. The idea of being truly cut off, the way winter guests once were, is almost unimaginable. But the building remembers. It remembers months when no one could leave, when the only sounds were wind and your own thoughts echoing in empty hallways. It remembers what happens to people when they cannot escape themselves, when comfort becomes confinement, when beauty cannot fill the hours. The ghost stories, whether you believe them or not, tap into this memory. They are expressions of a deeper truth. Isolation changes people, not always in supernatural ways, but in real psychological ones. Spend enough time alone in a beautiful cage, and you start to hear things, see things, feel things that might not be there. The mind creates company when none exists. The building becomes animate because you need it to be. Stanley built the hotel to prove survival was possible. King wrote a novel proving survival was not guaranteed. Both men were right. The hotel has survived, but so have the questions it raises about what we build when we try to outrun death, whether through medicine or art or architecture. Every monument to immortality is also an admission of mortality. You do not build for the ages unless you know your own time is limited. Stanley poured his fortune into stone and wood because his lungs had taught him that flesh fails. The hotel was his bid for permanence, his engineering solution to the problem of being human. And it worked, mostly. He is remembered, though not as he imagined. His building stands, though transformed. His story continues, though merged with other stories. The Palace of Light has learned to live in shadows. The cure has become a meditation on what haunts us. Stand on that veranda at dusk. Watch the sun drop behind the peaks. Feel the temperature plummet as light fails. The mountains do not care about hotels or ghost stories or any human concern. They were here before Stanley arrived, gasping, and will remain long after the last guest checks out. But in the space between mountain indifference and human fragility, something worth preserving exists. A building that helped some people heal and scared others. A place where ambition and fear built rooms filled with beauty and quiet terror. A monument to the idea that we can create shelter against the darkness, even if that shelter is imperfect, even if it becomes something we never intended. The Stanley Hotel is still running. The machinery of hospitality and history and horror tourism turns daily. Guests arrive and depart. Staff clean rooms and lead tours. The building settles and creaks. The mountains watch. And somewhere in those 140 rooms, someone is lying awake, listening to sounds they cannot explain, wondering if the thin air and old walls and weight of story have created something real, or if they are simply confronting the fear we all share. That isolation, whether sought or forced, reveals who we truly are when no one else is watching. That is what Stanley built, intentionally or not a cure, not a nightmare, but a place where both are possible, where the line between healing and haunting is as thin as mountain air, where you can check out, but some part of you might never truly leave. The palace above the clouds endures. The question it poses endures with it. When we build monuments against death, do we create safety or simply new corridors for fear to echo through? Stand on the veranda at dusk. The answer, like the mountains, remains silent.